Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson was a Confederate general during the American Civil War, and the best-known Confederate commander after General Robert E. Lee. His military career includes the Valley Campaign of 1862 and his service as a corps commander in the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. Confederate pickets accidentally shot him at the Battle of Chancellorsville on May 2, 1863. The general survived but lost an arm to amputation. He died of complications from pneumonia 8 days later. His death was a severe setback for the Confederacy, affecting not only its military prospects, but also the morale of its army and of the general public. Jackson in death became an icon of Southern heroism and commitment, and became a mainstay in the pantheon of the lost cause. Military historians consider Jackson to be one of the most gifted tactical commanders in U.S. history. His Valley Campaign and his envelopment of the Union Army's right wing at Chancellorsville are studied worldwide, even today, as examples of innovative and bold leadership. He excelled as well in other battles. The First Battle of Bull Run, where he received his famous nickname Stonewall, the Second Battle of Bull Run, and the battles of Antietam and Fredericksburg. Jackson was not universally successful as a commander, however, as displayed by his later rival and confused efforts during the 7 Days battles around Richmond, Indiana, 1862. Early life. Paternal ancestry. Thomas Jonathan Jackson was the great-grandson of John Jackson and Elizabeth Cummins. John Jackson was an Ulster Scots Protestant from Coleraine, County Londonderry, Ireland. While living in London, England, he was convicted of the capital crime of larceny for stealing £170. The judge at the Old Bailey sentenced him to 7 years of indentured servitude in America. Elizabeth, a strong, blonde woman over 6 feet tall, born in London, was also convicted of larceny in an unrelated case for stealing 19 pieces of silver, jewelry, and fine lace, and received a similar sentence. They both were transported on the prison ship Lichfield, which departed London in May 1749 with 150 convicts. John and Elizabeth met on board and were in love by the time the ship arrived at Annapolis, Maryland. Although they were sent to different locations in Maryland for their indentures, the couple married in July 1755. The family migrated west across the Blue Ridge Mountains to settle near Moorfield, Virginia in 1758. In 1770, they moved farther west to the Tygart Valley. They began to acquire large parcels of virgin farming land near the present-day town of Buckhannon, including 3,000 acres in Elizabeth's name. John and his 2 teenage sons were early recruits for the American Revolutionary War, fighting in the Battle of Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780. John finished the war as captain and served as a lieutenant of the Virginia militia after 1787. While the men were in the army, Elizabeth converted the home to a haven, Jackson's Fort, for refugees from Indian attacks. John and Elizabeth had 8 children. The second son was Edward Jackson, and Edward's third son was Jonathan Jackson, Thomas's father. Jonathan's mother died in 1798 and his father remarried 3 years later. His father and stepmother had 9 more children. Early childhood. Thomas Jackson was the 3rd child of Julia Beckworth Jackson and Jonathan Jackson, an attorney. Both of Jackson's parents were natives of Virginia. The family already had 2 young children and were living in Clarksburg, in what is now West Virginia, when Tommy was born. He was named for his maternal grandfather. There is some dispute about the actual location of Jackson's birth. A historical marker on the flood wall in Parkersburg, West Virginia, claims that he was born in a cabin near that spot when his mother was visiting her parents who lived there. There are writings which indicate that in Jackson's early childhood, he was called the Real Macaroni, though the origin of the nickname and whether it really existed are unclear. Thomas's sister Elizabeth died of typhoid fever on March 6, 1826, with 2-year-old Thomas at her bedside. His father also died of a typhoid fever on March 26. Jackson's mother gave birth to Thomas's sister Laura, and the day after Jackson's father died, Julia Jackson thus was widowed at 28 and was left with much debt and 3 young children. She sold the family's possessions to pay the debts. She declined family charity and moved into a small rented one-room house. Julia took in sewing and taught school to support herself and her 3 young children for about 4 years. In 1830, Julia Neal Jackson remarried. Her new husband, Blake Woodson, an attorney, did not like his stepchildren. There were continuing financial problems. The following year, after giving birth to Thomas's half-brother William Wirt Woodson, Julia died of complications, leaving her 3 older children orphaned. Julia was buried in an unmarked grave in a homemade coffin in Westlake Cemetery along the James River and Kanawha Turnpike in Fayette County within the corporate limits of present-day Ansted, West Virginia. Working and teaching at Jackson's Mill, the mother's health continued to fail. Jackson and his sister Laura were sent to live with the half-uncle, Cummins Jackson, who owned a grist mill in Jackson's Mill. Their older brother, Warren, went to live with other relatives on his mother's side of the family, but he later died of tuberculosis in 1841 at the age of 20. Thomas and Laura returned from Jackson's Mill in November 1831 to be at the dying mother's bedside. They spent 4 years together at the mill before being separated. Laura was sent to live with her mother's family. Thomas to live with his Aunt Polly and her husband Isaac Brake on a farm 4 miles from Clarksburg. Thomas was treated by Brake as an outsider and, having suffered verbal abuse for over a year, ran away from the family. When his cousin in Clarksburg urged him to return to Aunt Polly's, he replied, "Maybe I ought to, Mom, but I'm not going to." Quote, He walked 18 miles through mountain wilderness to Jackson's Mill, where he was welcomed by his uncles, and he remained there for the following 7 years. Cummins Jackson was strict with Thomas, who looked up to Cummins as a schoolteacher. Jackson helped around the farm, tending sheep with the assistance of a sheepdog, driving teams of oxen and helping harvest wheat and corn. Formal education was not easily obtained, but he attended school when and where he could. Much of Jackson's education was self-taught. He once made a deal with one of his uncle's slaves to provide him with pine knots in exchange for reading lessons. Tommy would stay up at night, reading borrowed books by the light of those burning pine knots. Virginia law forbade teaching a slave-free black mulatto to read or write. Nevertheless, Jackson secretly taught the slave, as he had promised. Once literate, the young slave fled to Canada via the Underground Railroad. In his later years at Jackson's Mill, Thomas served as a schoolteacher. Brother against sister. The Civil War has sometimes been referred to as a war of brother against brother, but in the case of the Jackson family, it was brother against sister. Laura Jackson Arnold was close to her brother Thomas until the Civil War period. As the war loomed, she became a staunch Unionist in a somewhat divided Harrison County. She was so strident in her beliefs that she expressed mixed feelings upon hearing of Thomas's death. One Union officer said that, though she seemed depressed at hearing the news, her Unionism was stronger than her family bonds. In a letter, he wrote that Laura had said she would rather know that he was dead than to have him a leader in the rebel army. Quote, Her Union sentiment also estranged her later from her husband, Jonathan Arnold. Early military career. West Point. In 1842, Jackson was accepted to the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. Because of his inadequate schooling, he had difficulty with the entrance examinations and began his studies at the bottom of his class. Displaying a dogged determination that was to characterize his life, he became one of the hardest-working cadets in the academy, and moved steadily up the academic rankings. Jackson graduated 17th out of 59 students in the class of 1846. It was said by his peers that if he had stayed there another year, he would have graduated first. U.S. Army and the Mexican War. Jackson began his United States Army career as a second lieutenant in the 1st U.S. Artillery Regiment and was sent to fight in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. He served at the Siege of Veracruz and the battles of Contreras, Chapultepec, and Mexico City, eventually earning 2 brevet promotions, and the regular Army rank of first lieutenant. It was in Mexico that Thomas Jackson first met Robert E. Lee. During the assault on Chapultepec Castle, he refused what he felt was a bad order to withdraw his troops. Confronted by his superior, he explained his rationale, claiming withdrawal was more hazardous than continuing his overmatched artillery duel. His judgment proved correct, and the relieving brigade was able to exploit the advantage Jackson had broached. In contrast to this display of strength of character, he obeyed what he also felt was a bad order when he raked a civilian throng with artillery fire after the Mexican authorities failed to surrender. Mexico City at the hour demanded by the U.S. forces. The former episode, and later aggressive action against the retreating Mexican army, earned him field promotion to the brevet rank of major. After the war, Jackson was briefly assigned to forts in New York, and then to Florida during the second interbellum of the Seminole Wars, during which the Americans were attempting to force the remaining Seminoles to move west. He was stationed briefly at Fort Casey before being named second in command at Fort Meade, a small fort about 30 miles south of Tampa. His commanding officer was Major William H. French. Jackson and French disagreed often, and filed numerous complaints against each other. Jackson stayed in Florida less than a year, Lexington and the Virginia Military Institute. In the spring of 1851, Jackson accepted a newly created teaching position at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. He became professor of natural and experimental philosophy and instructor of artillery. Parts of Jackson's curriculum are still taught at VMI, regarded as timeless military essentials. Discipline, mobility, assessing the enemy's strength and intentions while attempting to conceal your own, and the efficiency of artillery combined with an infantry assault. Though he spent a great deal of time preparing in depth for each class meeting, Jackson was unpopular as a teacher. His students called him Tom Fool. He memorized his lectures and then recited them to the class. Any student who came to ask for help was given the same explanation as before, and if a student asked for help a second time, Jackson viewed him as insubordinate and punished him. For his tests, Jackson typically had students simply recite memorized information that he had given them. The students mocked his apparently stern, religious nature and his eccentric traits. In 1856, a group of alumni attempted to have Jackson removed from his position. Jackson's peculiar personal traits contributed to his unpopularity as an educator. With little sense of humor, he once tried to get a cadet dismissed from VMI for playing a prank on him. He was a hypochondriac who had sinus problems and arthritis and stood for long periods of time to keep his internal organs in place, a tiring activity that he believed contributed to good health. He rarely ate much food and often subsisted on crackers and milk. He required little sleep but was known to take cat naps. He liked mineral baths. The founder of VMI and one of its first two faculty members was John Thomas Lewis Preston. Preston's second wife, Margaret Junkin Preston, was the sister of Jackson's first wife, Eleanor. In addition to working together on the VMI faculty, Preston taught Sunday school with Jackson and served on his staff during the Civil War. Slavery. Little as he was known to the white inhabitants of Lexington, Jackson was revered by many of the African Americans in town, both slaves and free blacks. He was instrumental in the organization in 1855 of Sunday school classes for blacks at the Presbyterian Church. His second wife, Mary Anna Jackson, taught with Jackson, as he preferred that my labors should be given to the colored children, believing that it was more important and useful to put the strong hand of the gospel under the ignorant African race, to lift them up. The pastor, Dr. William Spotswood White, described the relationship between Jackson and his Sunday afternoon students. In the religious instruction he succeeded wonderfully. His discipline was systematic and firm, but very kind. His servants reverenced and loved him as they would have done a brother or father. He was emphatically the black man's friend. Quote, he addressed his students by name and they, in turn, referred to him affectionately as Mas Major. Jackson's family owned 6 slaves in the late 1850s. 3 were received as a wedding present. Another, Albert, requested that Jackson purchase him and allow him to work for his freedom. He was employed as a waiter in one of the Lexington hotels and Jackson rented him to VMI. Amy also requested that Jackson purchase her from a public slave auction and she served the family as a cook and housekeeper. The 6th, Emma, was a 4-year-old orphan with a learning disability, accepted by Jackson from an aged widow and presented to his second wife, Mary Anna, as a welcome home gift. After the American Civil War began, he appears to have hired out or sold his slaves. Mary Anna Jackson, in her 1895 memoir, said, "Our servants, without the firm guidance and restraint of the master, the excitement of the times proved so demoralizing to them that he deemed it best for me to provide them with good homes among the permanent residents." James Robertson wrote about Jackson's view on slavery. Jackson neither apologized for nor spoke in favor of the practice of slavery. He probably opposed the institution. Yet in his mind the Creator had sanctioned slavery. A man had no moral right to challenge its existence. The good Christian slaveholder was one who treated his servants fairly and humanely at all times, marriages and family life. While an instructor at VMI in 1853, Thomas Jackson married Eleanor Ellie Junkin, whose father, George Junkin, was president of Washington College in Lexington. An addition was built onto the president's residence for the Jacksons, and when Robert E. Lee became president of Washington College, he lived in the same home, now known as the Lee-Jackson House. Ellie gave birth to a stillborn son on October 22, 1854, experiencing a hemorrhage an hour later that proved fatal. After a tour of Europe, Jackson married again in 1857. Mary Anna Morrison was from North Carolina, where her father was the first president of Davidson College. Her sister, Isabella Morrison, was married to Daniel Harvey Hill. They had a daughter named Mary Graham on April 30, 1858, but the baby died less than a month later. Another daughter was born in 1862, shortly before her father's death. The Jacksons named her Julia Laura, after his mother and sister. Jackson purchased the only house he ever owned while in Lexington. Built in 1801, the brick townhouse at 8 East Washington Street was purchased by Jackson in 1859. He lived in it for 2 years before being called to serve in the Confederacy. Jackson never returned to his home. John Brown raid aftermath. In November 1859, at the request of the governor of Virginia, Major William Gilham led a contingent of the VMI Cadet Corps to Charlestown to provide an additional military presence at the hanging of militant abolitionist John Brown on December 2. Following his raid on the Federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry on October 16, Major Jackson was placed in command of the artillery, consisting of 2 howitzers manned by 21 cadets.